Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to investigate and take a look at the victims of Gerald Eugene Stano, one of Florida's most prolific serial killers. And we are going to put a focus on the Jane Does known as Madam X from Altamonte Springs, and also the Jane Doe that's known as Median Jane Doe or the Jane Doe from Daytona Beach, because these two victims still are unidentified and likely have family out there that do not know whatever happened to their loved one. Where we left off in part 1, you had the murder of Kathy Lee Scharf. Stano had confessed to murdering her, and we have a mistrial. Her death was out of the Seventh Circuit, where Stano was allowed to plead to any number of victims within that circuit, wherein he would not get any death penalty charges. He would just get more life charges. However, as time passed, he ended up, perhaps inadvertently at first, but then admitting to the death of Kathy Lee Scharf. She was outside of the district, and therefore he ended up being charged for that, and they were seeking the death penalty against Stano. Since the first trial ended in a mistrial, that is when the alleged informant, the snitch, Clarence Zach, came forth and then added that Stano had also previously confessed to him. And this informant became a bit of a problem, as snitches often do, because people then allege on appeal later that the informant was a police informant. He was planted there. The thing is this would have been in retrospect, because everybody assumed that Stano's case for Scharf was a slam dunk. So in theory, there would have not been a reason to plant Clarence Zach there and then not have him even testify at the first trial, and then after the mistrial come forth with this information. So it's kind of a wacky concept on appeal, yet it was floated on appeal like many kind of odd concepts are floated. There was also about coercion, that Stano was just confessing because he was addicted to confessing the cases he didn't do. I have opinions on that. I think that if he can lead people to the bodies, and that if he can identify things that weren't released to the public, then more than likely he was the killer, if it also met his MO, if it had every earmark of what he did. However, by that same token, could he have gotten that information from, say, a detective or someone that had information about things that weren't released to the media? Sure, but then you'd have to at some point be putting all these different people into suspicion and then believing the serial killer. I mean, what would you rather believe, that it's a vast conspiracy, or the serial killer's a liar? So let's get back to where I left off in part 1. Clarence Zach claims that he had an hour-and-a-half long confession with Stano in the exercise yard, and that Stano spilled his guts to them, that they were the only prisoners in the yard, and that they first talked about cars, and this just naturally segued into murder. Now think, they'd never met before. And Stano volunteered that the police tore apart his car looking for blood in these murder cases, but they didn't find any. And that Stano said, quote, "They think I'm dumb enough to kill girls in my car and leave blood when I kill them? I don't splatter blood all over my car." That was the end quote. So there was nothing in the evidence indicating prearrangement with law enforcement or anyone with Clarence Zach being near Stano to obtain anything from Stano. The courts ended up looking at this, and this is what they found to be legally true. In my opinion, Clarence Zach saw an opportunity and he went for it. There's no evidence that was found by the courts later that Zach was a government agent. He was an opportunist at best. Zach also didn't tell anyone about Stano's confession or even participate in Stano's first trial because Zach allegedly assumed Stano would be convicted at this first trial. Zach only squealed after Stano's mistrial. So Zach said that Stano told him that he'd picked up the victim, Kathy Scharf, while she was hitchhiking. That Stano told him he took her to the woods in Merritt Island and that he told her it was time to pay and he wanted ussy, okay? Not going to say the word. He told Zach he beat the victim, he stabbed her, and he choked her. He dragged her under the palm fronds and covered her with palm fronds, brush, and limbs, and then after that, he drove to a gas station, he washed up, and then he went roller skating. As a side note, this was a common thing with Stano. He liked to go roller skating. Everybody went roller skating in the 70s. Zach was polygraphed, and the results were found to be non-deceptive. For this murder, the murder of Kathy Lee Scharf, Stano first confessed to Paul Crow. Okay, that was the first person he confessed to. Later on, they alleged that Crow was on this big coercion campaign with Stano, getting him to confess to all these murders he didn't initially confess to. So that was the first person he confessed to. Then he confessed twice to John Manus. This is a different man from a different agency, all right? Then he allegedly confesses to Clarence Albert Zach, the snitch. And then Stano wrote letters to the press. He gave press interviews, all right? So that's how many confessions now? Then, after that, Stano confessed to a psychologist, Dr. Messenden, his own psychologist. No reason to lie to that person. However, at the sentencing hearing for the Scharf murder, Stano, he did confess to all these other murders, and, he confessed. He admitted it. He said, essentially, Judge, I did all these others, but I didn't do this one. And you got to wonder why he did that. Because she was out of the 7th Judicial Circuit. So she could give him the death penalty. This is why he wanted to distance himself from Scharf. So we're supposed to believe that Lieutenant Paul B. Crow, who interviewed Stano, had such a great power of suggestion that he ended up getting Stano to produce all these confessions to all these different women because he had some great power of persuasion. Did they develop a rapport? Absolutely. He was essentially one of the first people to ever get Stano to confess. So they did have a rapport. I'm not arguing that. But I don't think he had some power of suggestion to get Stano to admit to all these different murders that Stano didn't have some connection to. And even if a snitch, this Zach guy, was fabricating testimony, it doesn't make the other confessions invalid. Just like Stano stood up in court, essentially, and told the judge, I did all the others, but I didn't do this one. Who are you going to believe at this point? So let me give the last word on Kathy Lee Scharf to the parents. They were too emotionally traumatized to testify at her retrial, and that was another issue on appeal. They tried to make hay at the fact that since her parents didn't testify, that Stano, didn't have the right to come against his accusers. But, they really weren't accusers. They were just witnesses to say she left the house at a certain time, and she said she'd be back at the house. And they read their first court statements from the first trial into the record. They weren't any kind of witnesses that were going to make or break Stano's case. But they, of course, on appeal, they will throw everything at the wall to see what will stick and try to make it like the parents were being truculent and not wanting to testify. Basically, they were older folks and they were literally broken down by the first trial and the fact that he'd admitted to all the string of murders, but yet he wouldn't admit to their child's murder because he knew he would get the death penalty for it. And it was just too emotionally traumatizing for them to testify at his retrial. So on May 19th, 1988, when Stano was given his first reprieve, the mother, Edith Scharf, said, I could kill that. If they would just let me have him, I want him so bad I'd tear his damn head off. So let's get into Madam X. Madam X is one of the reasons I'm doing this series, because she is out there and she is unidentified, and likely someone is wondering what happened to their mother, what happened to their wife, what happened to perhaps a grandma. Someone was loved and someone went missing, and she deserves to be identified. So please pay attention to this story. On November 24th, 1974, Madam X was found by a 20-year-old man who discovered the victim. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was riding his mini bike off Cherokee Road behind the Interstate Mall. Cherokee Road is now known as North Lake Boulevard if you're in Altamonte Springs, okay? And it was the Interstate Mall, not the Altamont Mall that's there now. The Interstate Mall was less than a mile away from the Altamont Mall, and it's currently now a Burlington coat factory. So I've seen that incorrectly on the internet. Let's clear that up. So the man, he's 20 years old. He is riding his mini bike. He discovers the victim. He sees the body lying in the brush behind Montgomery Ward's at the Interstate Mall. And so he calls the police, who come out to the scene. So the Altamonte Springs Police Department respond to the scene. It is within their jurisdiction. It's Seminole County, Florida. It's in a wooded area. And the body had been deceased for approximately 3 to 4 weeks. All right, so let me read you the statistics. She was white female, age between 40 to 55 years old, weight between 140 to upwards of 160 pounds, maybe a little heavier, perhaps she had been heavier. The hair was a light golden red blonde or a dark brown, but it had been dyed darker brown, and it had just a slight bit of wave to it. But the body was quite decomposed. It did not have a lot of flesh on it. So you have to do the best you can do by looking at the skeleton and things like that. Looking at her pelvis, that she had had between 1 to 2 children in her lifetime. She was missing 16 teeth and likely had never been to a dentist. She had very poor oral hygiene. Her height was, she was a short woman. Her height was between like 5 feet tall and 5'3". She was stocky. Well, actually, she was large-chested is what they said. And she was wearing blue knit pants, all right? Her pants were pulled down. Her shirt was pulled up. One distinguishing feature of Madam X that could help her be identified is that she had a bridal set that she was wearing. It was a diamond engagement ring with a wedding band, and I'll pop the picture up here. Only 18 of these were sold, and those 18 were sold in California or Arizona. So I'm thinking Madam X was from either California or Arizona. So that is a good tip. Second great tip, other than the teeth, you might say that the fact she'd probably never seen a dentist is not that great, because you wouldn't have a dental comparison to make. One notable thing about her teeth is it's consistent. She had marks on certain teeth that were consistent with her being a seamstress, a weaver, or perhaps even a hairdresser, meaning that there were grooves in certain teeth indicative of having thread pulled through them or used in a pulling motion through years and years wearing a groove in certain teeth. And I believe that the Smithsonian looked at the body and said that they believed that they'd seen that kind of mark, these crescent-shaped marks in teeth that are consistent with people being seamstresses, weavers, or the like. So that's another great tip. Think age 40 to 55, older lady, might have had 2 kids. Who's missing their wife? Who is missing their grandma? Someone a little bit larger. At that time in the 70s, people tended to be rather svelte, and she would have stuck out. Her teeth, she was missing 16 of her teeth, and so she probably didn't smile a whole bunch. She was married. She had a husband, or she wore a ring indicating such. She was right off of I-4 4 and 436 right by that exit. The Altamonte Springs Police Department did everything they could do back in 1974 and onward with the technology they had at the time to try to identify who Madam X was. They had sketches made of her face to try to, ID her, and that was fruitless. And then they had her skull made into a clay sculpture. They used her skull and did a facial reconstruction using the clay. And they made a composite that I'll show here so you can see what they think that she might have looked like. So they tried that. Still not identified. And then her body, I do believe, at different points was taken to the Natural History Museum. I believe it was a Smithsonian. And then there was a Florida State Department that looked at the body and may still even have the skull to this day. They're just trying to still identify this victim. She's known as Madam X, Jane Doe, 1974, Altamonte Springs. It's still an open case. They want to identify her. They're not, as long as I know, Stano has confessed to her murder. Let me get to that. On October of 1982, Stano confessed to killing this Jane Doe. He essentially started confessing that he found a Jane Doe, and she was standing at 436 near I-4, hitchhiking, and that he exited to buy the I-4 exit there to buy beer, and that he gave this Jane Doe a ride, but she refused his sexual advances, and she told him he was too fat, all right? And he drove along the road behind the mall, that would be the Interstate Mall, and that he killed her by stabbing her with a 4-inch hunting knife in her chest and abdomen, and he left the Jane Doe in an overgrown field with her purse and her shoes missing. So he took her purse, he took her shoes, as he always did. This was his MO. He pulled her pants down, he pulled her top up. Again, another Stano MO, he tended to do that. And that he left her there. And that on his way back, he tossed the purse and the shoes out the door like he always said he did. And then Altamonte and the rest went, oh my gosh, this is Madam X. He's confessing to Madam X. So they proceeded to try to talk to Stano. And he ends up, like I said, confessing to her murder. And in order to back up what he's saying, because the police want to have other evidence. And back then, they just did not have the kind of fibers. You have a decomposed body. You just don't have that kind of linkage. And so they wanted to say, make it prove it. And so what he did was on October 27th, 1983, Stano directed the police right to the place where he left the murdered woman. So he took them to the spot. So to those folks who want to say, oh, Stano just confessed all over the place and he'd see something in a newspaper clipping and he'd admit to it. Well, then how in the world? Because those newspaper clippings that you're going to see on my screen do not show you exactly where anything is. It's a dot on a map, all right? Well, guess what? He took him exactly to the spot he laid the body. Sometimes Stano was so accurate, he'd take somebody to 2 feet of where the body was found. So he led the police right to the body. So long story short, on January 15th, 1984, Sanford Circuit Court Judge Robert B. McGregor handed down a life sentence to Stano for the Jane Doe known as Madam X. And this, at this point in the chronology, was Stano's 7th life sentence. See, Stano waived a jury trial in a bargain with the state of Florida that they wouldn't seek the death penalty if he was convicted. So that was the dice he was willing to roll. He had his bench trial. The judge convicted him. And so Stano was convicted of stabbing the Jane Doe, known as Madam X, and leaving her body in a field near the Altamonte Springs shopping mall. Now, when he was asked after what he thought of it, Stano later said that the judge's verdict was fair. He had no issues with confessing to this murder, and the police believed that he was the one who did it because he knew things that were not admitted to the public at that time. And then he went and he led them right to where he'd left the body. At this point, the Altamont Mall was the mall. that everybody used, not the Interstate Mall. At this point, it was defunct. If I remember correctly, it was already, by 1974, I think it was starting. And by the time the Altamonte Mall started competing with Interstate Mall, the Interstate Mall was starting to fall into disrepair. So if a serial killer is going to get off I-4 and lead you on a goose chase, he's going to take you to the Altamonte Mall. He's not going to take you to the Burlington. Just FYI, because some people talk about the Altamonte Mall and they actually don't know what they're talking about. So that's the story of Madam X. Please take a look at the different pictures, and please note that these are reconstructions from a decomposed body. They are not 100% accurate. So if you know of someone that had this wedding ring set, that was a weaver or a seamstress, that had went missing in 74 or in the 70s, that was married, that perhaps had children, anyone who fits this description, the Altamonte Springs Police Department still has this as an open Jane Doe case. Again, Stano was convicted for this, so it's not that they are looking to pin a murder on somebody else. They are simply looking to identify the victim. So please keep her in your thoughts and your prayers. Let's move on to the next lady. Her name is Nancy Hurd. She was 24 years old, and she moved to Florida from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for a fresh start. She was working as a beachside motel maid in Daytona Beach, and one day she just went missing from the Mandarin Motel in Daytona. And on January 3rd, 1975, her body was found near Tomoka State Park. So the body had been dead approximately 12 hours when it was found. It was found fully clothed. Tomoka State Park is about 3 miles north of the Holiday Inn Boardwalk. The body was still wearing glasses with her shirt pulled up. Typical Stano MO. The investigators discovered her identity by tracing a book of matches found at the scene back to the motel where she was employed. I believe that was the Mandarin Motel in Daytona. I don't know if the Mandarin Motel is still in business. Detective Hudson was placed in charge of this case, and not coincidentally, Stano lived in Ormond Beach on this date in 1975. What happened was Stano ended up confessing, I believe it was in 1981, to picking up Nancy Hurd from the Mandarin Motel, and that they went for a drive. And he said that she needed money for rent and that she agreed to have sex with him. And he drove them both to Tomoka State Park, and that Nancy Hurd reminded him of Michelina, who at this point was going to be Stano's fiance. And he said, quote, of Nancy, "She started to sound like my future wife, bitching, 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 and I wasn't about to take it from anybody." So that is what he confessed to the Nancy Hurd murder. He knew more details. It was a longer confession. This is just a quote from part of his confession. Another tie-in to a case that's coming up, there's a case of Mary Carol Maher. And what happens, this is how the police were doing their jobs. Okay, you have different murders from different jurisdictions, and they contact each other to say, hey, I found a body. Do you have anybody that's missing? This is what we want the police to do. Well, Crow from Daytona Beach, who was the first person that Stano started confessing to, had contacted Dave Hudson from the Volusia County Sheriff's Office and inquired if they had similar crime victims. That they were left, they were missing their shoes, they had their shirts pulled up, they had their pants pulled down, that they were white, that they were female, that, that whole thing with the drowning, or the stabbing and the choking. And that Hudson thought of Nancy Hurd when Crow called him, and also of Linda Hamilton. That's another victim coming up. So these police officers are doing what we want them to do, guys. They are sharing information over the jurisdictions. If they find a murder victim, they are sharing the information with the other jurisdictions. If they know a serial killer is operating in a certain area, they share his MO with the other jurisdictions. And after the tie-in with Mary Carol Maher, who we'll get to in our sequence, Crow from Daytona Beach contacted Dave Hudson from Volusia County Sheriff's Office, and he simply inquired if they had similar crime victims. But this is how the pieces of the puzzle start getting put together. So what they did was on March 13th, 1981, the authorities drove Stano to Tomoka State Park because he had already confessed to 2 murders in that vicinity. So Stano mentioned that he liked to meditate at Tomoka State Park because his grandparents were buried there. He identified one of the locations of the victim's remains of a victim upcoming, Ramona Neal. Then he went and he turned around and he directed the officers to the approximately 2 miles away to an area of power lines where he had left Nancy Hurd. And he called the area, quote, Cobb's Corner. So he had nicknames for all these areas. And then he ended up saying, you see the power lines? And the officer said, no, I don't see any power lines. He's like, they're right there. And he went, and then Hudson, who covered the Hurd case, then he recognized the area. Oh my gosh, this is exactly where Nancy Hurd was found. This went on over and over in the Stano case, where back in the 70s, they didn't have enough information because the bodies either were decomposed or they didn't have fibers or whatever the story was. And then what they end up having a confession that matches the details of the case. Maybe he'll throw in an extra like the RC Cola that they didn't release to the public. And then they'll say, okay, take us to where you left this victim. He may or may not know their names. He'll take them right to the spot. All right, what else do you want? Yeah, great. It'd be great to have DNA evidence inside of them. The thing is it wasn't Stano's MO to rape his victims. Sometimes he picked up a prostitute. Sometimes he had sex with them if it was a prostitute. But usually, most of the time, then he didn't kill them. It was when they refused sex with him or they changed the radio station or they did something to tick him off and he hadn't had sex with them. Back then, we didn't have touch DNA and all the things we have now. So just to sum, Stano apparently led the investigators directly to many of these victims, but the bodies held no other viable evidence linking them to Stano because there just simply wasn't the evidence or the ability to do that kind of tracing back in the 70s. DNA analysis was not available and it wasn't tested in those days. And I know this sounds like a lot of victims, and I'm only on like the 4th or 5th victim in this story, and there are so many. I had to focus more on the ones where a little more information is known. Otherwise, it just reads like a list. The next lady, Diana Lynn Valleck, was only 18 years old. Her hometown was in Tampa, and she worked at the Nature's Playpen in Tampa. So it's believed that she was an exotic dancer at that establishment. She was a professional go-go dancer, and so she worked at many establishments on the Strip. Some of the places she worked were the Carrollwood Bottle Club, the Sportsman Bar, and Nature's Playpen. So that was her choice of work. Some of her friends last saw her serving drinks at a club called Twilight in mid-May. And we're talking May 15th, 1975. So on May 15th, 1975, the last time someone actually saw her was she was seen hitchhiking from work as she did out of habit. Again, this was the 70s. Hitchhiking, putting your thumb out was a thing. It really was. And I don't know if I've mentioned it yet in this series, but in the coming years, gas becomes an international issue and the price of gas skyrockets. So people in the 70s, commonly, they learned to roller skate, they rode their bikes, and they walked a lot because there's going to be a gas crisis that comes up that makes driving a very expensive proposition. Just FYI, if people wonder why in the world people did so much hitchhiking